This was the week a ghost of the past came back to haunt the US military.
This woman was forced into the sex trade to service US soldiers during and after the Korean War. Myung-soo was 15 years old at the time. For $5 to $10 per soldier, she endured a lifetime of shame. But now she's demanding accountability from the US military and the South Korean government for their complicity in the sex trade.
A video from Al Jazeera on YouTube called How Korea's Sex Trade Was Built for US Soldiers. Rebecca, what's the story?
So on Monday at a press conference in Seoul, it was announced that a group of 117 women has filed a lawsuit against the US government via the South Korean government. It's a bit complicated, over their experience as sex workers in state-sanctioned brothels servicing US troops from the 50s into the 80s and in some forms even into the early 2000s as well. The issue has already been before the courts in South Korea in 2022. The country's Supreme Court ruled that the women were entitled to compensation from the South Korean government specifically, which was about £2,500 each. The current lawsuit is about getting recognition and acknowledgement and also compensation from the US military. The suit has been filed in Seoul because South Korea technically, like any cases made against the US military for crimes allegedly committed on South Korean soil, have to go through the South Korean legal system. But they are now seeking 10 million won each, which is about £5,300. So again, not stacks of money, but a lot of it is about acknowledgement.
State-sanctioned brothels, just talk us through what happened.
Yeah, so not only, I mean, it's very common all over the world, obviously, for there to be brothels and sex workers around military installations. But in this case, there was it wasn't just a case of local authorities turning a blind eye to it. It was actively encouraged. The reason for that being that South Korea both wanted to maintain good relations with the US in the aftermath of the Korean War, but also the economy was extremely frail at the time, and the sex trade was seen as a way of getting valuable dollars into the economy. So officials urged the women to basically work as hard as possible in order to put dollars into the economy. It was sort of met with an ambivalent attitude in South Korean society at the time. A contemporary newspaper called the so-called comfort women a cancer-like necessary evil, frontline warriors in winning dollars. So there was this sense of shame around them that's a bit, we can get into this a bit more later, but dissimilar to what happened with the more well-known comfort women who were forced to serve Japanese occupiers. This was almost a voluntary tribute from the South Korean government to the American allies.
And when you say dollars into the economy, so they were paid for their sex work, but they didn't spend it themselves, or they did and that's how it got into the economy, or it was taken from them?
So it was taken from them and it went to their pimps. It wasn't passed back directly to the government, but obviously the pimps were then spending the money in the economy, and so the dollars were going into circulation that way. The women themselves received very little, and in many cases nothing, and they had basically no control over their lives. Some of them were coerced or tricked into brothels in the first place. Some of them had been hired as barmaids in nightclubs. Some of them were just literally abducted off the street. Many of them were teenagers, and even those who did enter willingly say they had no control over, they were forced to work long hours, they were subjected to abuse and violence from their clients, and they were forced to undergo, as was mentioned in the video, these very invasive STD testing and treatment programs without consent, which involved basically they would be inspected, including by US military authorities. We can talk more about this, but the US was actively participating in this. They would be forced to show their card showing that they had tested clean for sexually transmitted diseases. And if they couldn't produce that and they were found to have an STD, they were basically shut up and unable to leave these treatment facilities until they had been cured, which involved being subjected to large amounts of penicillin. And some women also did die from penicillin shock.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important, I think, Harriet, to underline the conditions that these women were being kept in, because in some senses in the 21st century, when you hear about the state endorsing or supporting sex work, you might think of that as a progressive policy, like better than it being in the black market, better that people know where they are, better that their tax is collected. It wasn't like that.
I think it would be more accurate to describe these women as sex slaves, because there's such an enormous power disparity between US servicemen, military personnel supported by your own government, supported by the South Korean government, and these women, most of whom were coerced or exploited or even just, kidnapped into this effectively sexual slavery. And the conditions are the victim statements are so horrific, talking about them being locked in rooms and being forcibly injected with penicillin, where the shots made their legs give out, that they were dragged to the soldiers and abused every night. I think it's also fair to say that there's two rounds of victimization. You've got the first wave where the women were sold and abused and effectively tortured, and then you have this secondary victimization over the decades where they might have been socially stigmatized, excluded from their communities and families. That's often what we see in victims of sexual exploitation, is that they're then ostracized, or they suffer from diseases or health complications all their lives, and their stories are ignored or kind of hushed up. It was only in 2022 that South Korea's court ruled that the government had established and managed these brothels. So it's such a long time that these victims have had to be then kind of re-victimizing themselves, sharing these stories over and over again, and kind of using their trauma to try and get the compensation and the acknowledgement that they deserve.
And I guess because it went on so long, for many decades after the Korean War, there's sort of a sense amongst that generation of everybody, I was about to say generation of women, but men too, of just like, oh yeah, well that happened, we know that happened, and we don't talk about it. And it's almost like it takes a younger generation to come along and say, we did what?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think there were obviously early discussions about it, but you have to remember that in the Cold War, South Korea's survival kind of heavily depended on US military presence, and kind of publicly naming and shaming the US military would have risked kind of political backlash. So I think within society, there was a kind of a hush-hush mantra that meant that it wasn't really investigated, and the victims were marginalized, women getting older, suffering kind of stigma and shame. And basically, it wasn't until kind of society's thoughts about this stuff moved on a bit, and it wasn't until the 1980s that they got kind of increased media attention, and the Korean Council reframed the comfort woman issue as a human rights advocacy movement. I mean, it's partially also the movement, it seems, from what I've read, was about educating the public as much as restoring the dignity of the victims, was basically explaining to younger generations of South Koreans exactly what these crimes that happened occurred, and how it was kind of accepted by the government.
Yeah, and I guess, Rebecca, as well, that's a shift too, isn't it, in terms of who's broken the law. Prostitution's illegal. So I guess for decades, people's thoughts on this were, well, ergo, the prostitutes broke the law by practicing prostitution. Whereas now the opinion is, no, the government itself broke its own laws by pushing them into it.
Yeah, I mean, South Korea has prostitution has always been legal in South Korea. It was illegal then, it's legal now. And of course, the US military on paper is against its personnel patronizing sex workers. But on the ground, I mean, it is incredible. The US military authorities and local government officials would get together and they would organize English classes for these women. They would organize etiquette and culture classes to educate them more about interacting with Americans. The US military would go into nightclubs and bars, and it would ask to see the test cards to prove that women who were applying the sex trade in there had been tested recently. So the US military were not just turning a blind eye, they were actively involved. They actually also had files containing the details and photos of all of the registered prostitutes, as they were known at the time, so that servicemen who became infected with an STD could pick out the woman that they believed had given them the illness. And so those women then who tested positive were, as we've talked about previously, isolated in these closed medical facilities until they were deemed cured. So there really was an active and relatively open participation. I think the US military at the time, the idea was that it was better to be proactive rather than pretend that it wasn't happening. Obviously, you don't want soldiers coming down in large numbers with venereal disease, which is true in one sense, but obviously the women were the ones who ended up paying the price for this incredibly sophisticated and very regimented sex trade.
What's the US position on it now, Harriet? I mean, we're talking about it partly because it's being underreported. There's not that much out there to see what they think, is there?
There isn't, but what is interesting is that what a lot of people might not know is that the US military position on their service people using prostitutes is actually relatively new. For decades and decades, the fact that US servicemen would use prostitutes around bases in places like South Korea and Japan and Vietnam was absolutely kind of known about and sort of quietly tolerated. But in 2002, there were reports that US peacekeepers and military contractors were implicated in the sex trafficking networks in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the 90s. And that kind of put a spotlight on the link between the military deployment and prostitution and illegal trafficking. So that's when George Bush declared a zero tolerance policy on trafficking for US military personnel abroad. And then came the rule in 2006, which banned US service members from soliciting or using prostitutes in places where they were deployed, even if it was legal in the countries where they were. But the only reason that happened really was that they stopped framing it as an issue around use of sex workers and sort of framed it as like a national security issue, basically not wanting their service members implicated in these trafficking rings. So we shouldn't make the mistake of talking about this as if it's something that is confined to the past. The US still stations nearly 30,000 troops in South Korea to help protect it from North Korea, and stations troops all over the world and military contractors, as does the UK. And service members are often implicated in the use of prostitutes and in sexual assault, like significantly more so than the civilian population.
And also, I mean, the British Army, an investigation last month found some soldiers stationed at a controversial base in Kenya continued to use sex workers despite being banned from doing so. And the ban was put in place in 2022 by the UK Ministry of Defence, a kind of blanket ban for its forces using sex workers abroad as part of an effort to curb sexual exploitation and abuse. But it followed the death of a local Kenyan, Agnes Wanjiru, who was allegedly killed by a British soldier who was stationed at the base. This is something that continues into the present day. Obviously, the investigation the information was released last month showed that soldiers are still using sex workers despite being banned. In that situation, you have to ask yourself, what legal protections exist for local people, especially women, in these days. And it won't surprise anyone to know that a lot of this stuff is obviously hushed up by the military. But how long can we continue to say that this is okay as we move further and further into, the 21st century?
Well, I suppose one of the things that might help that, Jamie, is a verdict of some kind. What do you think justice would look like here? What do these women want?
Yeah, it's actually really kind of slightly up in the air. Holding the US military directly liable in a South Korean court obviously raises issues of sovereign immunity, international law, and whether even the US courts would accept claims like that. It's far from guaranteed that the US will be held legally accountable, despite the fact that obviously the lawsuit names both Seoul and Washington, so they are going after both. Even if compensation is awarded, many of the survivors have already said that an official apology from the US is what they're looking for. They're not just looking for money, but recognition of wrongdoing. And that's symbolic, but potentially would open the US military up to a lot of criticism in lots of different areas. So they might be unlikely to do that. A successful case obviously could set precedent for other similar cases around the world. And it could influence, how international law treats things like state complicity and military responsibility. I guess it's about really worrying about the kind of erasure of the knowledge about this. And part of the reason why I think it's a great story that we've brought today is because of how underreported it is and how, particularly in comparison to what Rebecca was saying about Japan and the comfort women, this is an example of something that has been kind of gone under the radar. So hopefully something like this, a court case like this, however it ends, will give a bit more, I guess, knowledge and awareness and a spotlight on this practice and for the victims involved. I
suppose as well, Rebecca, it's not a story that makes Korea look good, 40 years ago, but it sort of kind of speaks well to Korea now, to South Korea now that this is in court and that it is being spoken about.
Yeah, I mean, the existence of these women sits uncomfortably for South Korea because the more notorious use of comfort women by the Japanese, that fits in perfectly. It can be wielded as a weapon towards Korea's former colonial rulers with whom South Korea has historically had a hostile relationship. But the US is a key South Korean ally and always has been. So this case both tarnishes the glossy sheen of that alliance, but also gives Japan space to say, well, they did it too, because Korea has come down on Japan several times. I'd say probably motivated by politics rather than a sense of justice for the victims. But they can't do the same with the US. The US comfort women don't fit into South Korea's narrative about its own history. The idea that the Japanese colonized them and then later brutalized them during the war. And then the US came along and helped them achieve independence and prosperity. And of course, they still represent South Korea's strongest ally on the world stage. And the threat from North Korea is by no means absent, and there's still a widespread sort of public ambivalence to the story. It's certainly their voices are being heard now, but I think their story can't be wielded as a political weapon in the same way that the women exploited by Japanese personnel during World War II can. So it's never going to achieve that same level of prominence.